In the heart of Montana's unforgiving winter, billionaire rancher Ethan Callahan thought he owned everything that mattered, until one deadly blizzard brought him face to face with Aiyana Red Elk, an Apache woman who would challenge everything he believed about love, loyalty, and the price of redemption. When corporate greed threatens sacred tribal lands and a second storm puts lives at risk, Ethan must choose between the fortune that defined him and the woman who saved his soul. This is a story of two wounded hearts finding healing in the most unlikely place, where love doesn't arrive with fanfare, but survives through quiet courage. If you love stories of redemption, slow burn romance, and the healing power of love, hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that remind us what truly matters in life. Men like you don't save women like me without a reason. Billionaire cowboy rescues Apache woman. The Montana wind cut through the valley like a blade, carrying promises of the worst blizzard in 20 years. Ethan Callahan pulled his Stetson lower against the bite of December air, his breath forming clouds that disappeared into the gray twilight. From his position on the ridge overlooking his vast ranch, he could see his empire stretched out below 30,000 acres of prime grazing land, state-of-the-art facilities, and enough cattle to feed half the state. Yet standing there with his net worth climbing past the billion-dollar mark, Ethan felt as empty as the winter sky above. His horse Thunder shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing the approaching storm. Ethan understood the feeling. For the past 6 months, pressure had been mounting from his board of directors to acquire the adjacent tribal lands. The Red Elk Reservation sat on what geological surveys suggested might be the largest untapped natural gas reserve in the region. The potential profits were staggering. "A man can own half the land and still have nowhere to belong," he murmured to himself, the words carried away by the wind. His satellite phone buzzed. The screen showed his attorney's name, Marcus Webb, a man who measured success in dollar signs and quarterly reports. "Ethan, we need to talk about the Red Elk situation." Marcus's voice crackled through the static. "The tribal council meets next week. If you don't make a move now, Blackstone Energy will. They're offering twice what we initially proposed." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on him like the approaching storm clouds. "I told you, Marcus, I need more time to consider this. Time is money, and you're hemorrhaging both. Your father built this empire on smart decisions, not sentiment. The board is getting restless." The mention of his father sent a familiar chill through Ethan's chest, one that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. James Callahan had indeed built an empire, but he'd done it by crushing anyone who stood in his way, including several native communities whose land rights had conveniently disappeared in carefully orchestrated legal battles. "I'll call you tomorrow," Ethan said, ending the conversation before Marcus could respond. Thunder whinnied, pawing at the frozen ground. The first snowflakes were beginning to fall, fat and heavy, the kind that promised hours of relentless accumulation. Ethan knew he should head back to the main house, but something kept him on the ridge. Maybe it was the silence, the kind of profound quiet that only came before nature unleashed its fury. His ranch house sprawled across 5 acres, a monument to architectural achievement and personal isolation. 23 rooms that echoed with the footsteps of one man and the ghost of dreams he'd never pursued. At 32, Ethan had everything money could buy, and nothing that money couldn't. The wind picked up, howling through the valley with increasing intensity. Thunder danced sideways, nostrils flaring. This was no ordinary storm approaching. This was the kind of blizzard that killed unprepared travelers and buried entire herds under 15 feet of snow. As Ethan finally turned toward home, a flash of movement caught his eye near Red Mesa Ridge, the border between his land and the reservation. Through the swirling snow, he could make out a dark shape against the white landscape, a horse. But something was wrong. The animal was down, thrashing in what looked like pain or panic. Every instinct told him to ride for shelter. The storm was minutes from becoming deadly, and Red Mesa Ridge was a 20-minute ride in good weather. In these conditions, it could be a death sentence. But as he squinted through the increasing snow, Ethan saw something that made his heart stop. Near the fallen horse, barely visible against the white ground, was the dark outline of a human form. Someone was in trouble. Thunder fought against the reins as Ethan spurred him toward the ridge. The wind roared like a living thing, driving snow horizontally across the landscape until visibility dropped to mere yards. Each step became a gamble as the horse picked his way across terrain that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable. By the time they reached the ridge, the storm had transformed into a whiteout. Ethan dismounted his boots, sinking into snow that was already knee-deep. The fallen horse, a magnificent paint mare, lay on her side breathing heavily but alert. Her right front leg was trapped beneath a fallen branch, probably injured, but not broken. 10 feet away, partially buried in the snow, lay a woman. Ethan's breath caught it as he knelt beside her. She was unconscious but breathing, her long black hair contrasting starkly against the white snow. Her clothes, practical winter gear, but not adequate for this kind of storm, suggested she was from the reservation. High cheekbones and copper skin confirmed his suspicion. She was beautiful in a way that reminded him of the ancient stone carvings his grandmother used to show him, timeless, strong, and utterly serene even in unconsciousness. A leather satchel lay beside her, its contents scattered wildlife tracking equipment, notebooks, and what looked like scientific instruments. Ethan realized she must be one of the reservation's wildlife biologists, probably caught off guard by the storm while conducting research. The wind screamed around them, and Ethan knew they had minutes, not hours, before the cold became lethal. He quickly checked her pulse, steady but weak, then assessed her for obvious injuries. No broken bones that he could detect, but her lips were already showing a blue tinge that spoke of dangerous hypothermia. Thunder stamped nervously as Ethan gathered the woman in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but solid, the kind of lean strength that spoke of a life lived outdoors. As he lifted her, she stirred slightly, mumbling something in what sounded like Apache but didn't wake. "Easy, girl," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. Getting her onto Thunder's back while managing both the reins and the unconscious woman required every bit of ranching skill Ethan had learned over the years. Finally, with her secured in front of him and his arms holding her steady against his chest, he turned Thunder toward the only shelter within reach. The old line cabin his grandfather had built in the 1940s. The ride became a nightmare of white blindness and numbing cold. More than once, Thunder stumbled in hidden gullies or stopped abruptly at obstacles Ethan couldn't see until they were almost upon them. The woman in his arms remained unconscious, her breathing growing more shallow with each passing minute. When the dark outline of the cabin finally appeared through the snow, Ethan felt a rush of relief so intense it was almost painful. The small structure looked like salvation itself, rough-hewn logs and a stone chimney that promised warmth and safety. Dismounting with his unconscious burden proved even more challenging than mounting had been. By the time Ethan managed to kick open the cabin door and carry the woman inside, his hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline. The cabin was exactly as he remembered from childhood visits with his grandfather. One room with a stone fireplace, a simple wooden bed frame, a table and 2 chairs. Rustic but functional, and more importantly, stocked with firewood and basic supplies. Ethan laid the woman on the bed, quickly covering her with the heavy wool blankets his grandfather had always kept there. Her breathing was so shallow he had to watch closely to see the rise and fall of her chest. Hypothermia was a killer. He'd seen it claim ranch hands who thought they were tougher than Montana winter. Working with desperate efficiency, Ethan built a fire in the hearth. The familiar ritual of splitting kindling and arranging logs calmed his nerves slightly, but his eyes kept returning to the still form on the bed. Within minutes, flames were crackling against the stone backdrop, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's rough walls. The warmth felt like a blessing, but Ethan knew it might not be enough. Severe hypothermia required careful rewarming, and the woman's core temperature had dropped dangerously low during their time in the storm. Moving to the bed, Ethan faced a decision that made his hands shake for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. Her wet clothes were stealing what little body heat she had left. Medical training from his Army Reserve days fought against a lifetime of ingrained respect and propriety. Medicine 1. Working as clinically as possible, Ethan removed her snow-soaked outer garments and boots, replacing them with dry blankets and his own spare shirt from the cabin's storage chest. He kept his eyes on her face, monitoring her breathing and watching for signs of consciousness, while trying to ignore how vulnerable she looked in sleep. Her features were striking, not just beautiful, but strong. Even unconscious, there was something about her that suggested a person who didn't yield easily to life's challenges. A small scar on her left temple spoke of past adventures or misadventures, while calloused hands suggested someone who worked with her hands and wasn't afraid of physical challenges. As warmth began to fill the cabin, Ethan found himself studying her more closely. She looked to be around 30 with the kind of natural grace that couldn't be taught or purchased. Her hair now spread across the pillow, caught the firelight, and seemed to hold it, creating an almost ethereal effect in the flickering shadows. Outside, the storm reached its full fury. Wind howled around the cabin's eaves like something alive and hungry. Snow pounded against the single window with a sound like rice on a drumhead. Ethan had made the right choice. Anyone caught in the open now wouldn't survive until morning. It was nearly an hour before the woman stirred. Ethan was sitting by the fire, stoking the flames and watching her carefully when he heard a soft intake of breath that was different from her previous steady breathing. Her eyes opened slowly, and Ethan found himself looking into irises the color of dark amber. For a moment, she simply stared at the cabin's rough ceiling, getting her bearings. Then her gaze found his, and he saw intelligence, wariness, and something else. A quiet strength that reminded him of his grandfather's stories about the old ways. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse but clear, with just a hint of an accent that softened the consonants. "Safe," Ethan said simply. "You were caught in the storm near Red Mesa Ridge. I found you unconscious by your horse." She started to sit up, then stopped as dizziness clearly washed over her. "My horse, Sage, is she? She's hurt, but alive." Her leg was trapped under a fallen branch, but nothing appeared broken. "I couldn't bring her in the storm, but she was sheltered in a grove of pines." The woman closed her eyes, and Ethan saw relief wash over her features. When she opened them again, her gaze was more focused, taking in the cabin, the fire, and finally settling on him with an assessment that made him feel as if she were reading his character like one of her scientific instruments. "You're Ethan Callahan," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, and you are Aiyana Red Elk." She pulled the blankets more securely around herself, and Ethan noticed the gesture wasn't born of cold, but of caution. "I know who you are." The way she said it suggested his reputation had preceded him, and not necessarily in a good way. Ethan felt heat that had nothing to do with the fire creep up his neck. "You were hypothermic," he said, keeping his voice matter-of-fact. "I had to change your clothes to prevent further heat loss. They're drying by the fire." Aiyana's eyes found her clothes hanging on a makeshift line he'd rigged near the hearth, then returned to his face. Her expression was unreadable, but he saw her shoulders relax slightly. "Thank you," she said, and he heard something in those two words, surprise perhaps, or recognition of a debt she hadn't expected to owe. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Ethan found himself struggling with an unfamiliar awkwardness. He was used to commanding boardrooms, negotiating million-dollar deals, and making decisions that affected hundreds of employees. But sitting in this cabin with this woman, he felt as uncertain as a teenager. "How long have I been unconscious?" Aiyana asked. Ethan glanced at his watch. "About 2 hours. The storm's getting worse. We'll be here until it passes." She nodded, accepting this with the kind of pragmatic calm that spoke of someone familiar with nature's unpredictability. "I was tracking the wolf pack that's been moving through the area. Lost track of time when I found evidence of poaching." "Poaching?" Ethan's attention sharpened. "On reservation land, near the boundary between your land and ours." Aiyana's eyes met his, and he saw a challenge there. "Someone's been setting snares targeting the pack. It's illegal on both sides of the property line." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Ethan felt his jaw tighten as he realized what she was implying. "You think my people are involved?" "I think someone with access to both properties is involved." Her voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. "The snares are expensive, professional grade, not the work of casual hunters." Ethan stood and moved to the window, though there was little to see beyond the swirling white wall of the storm. The implication stung because he couldn't completely dismiss it. His ranch employed dozens of men, and while he tried to hire people who shared his conservation values, he couldn't vouch for every hand's activities during their off hours. "I don't allow hunting on my land without explicit permission," he said, his back still to her. "And I've never given permission for wolf hunting." "But you can't watch 30,000 acres all the time." He turned back to face her and saw she was sitting up now, the blanket pulled around her shoulders like a shawl. Even disheveled from her ordeal, there was something regal about her bearing. "No," he admitted, "I can't." The honesty seemed to surprise her. Her expression softened slightly, and Ethan glimpsed the woman behind the wariness, someone who was used to fighting battles, but not necessarily used to finding the potential allies. The pack is important to the ecosystem, Aiyana said. They've helped control the deer population, which has allowed vegetation to recover in areas that were overgrazed. It's taken us 5 years to establish this balance. I know, Ethan said, returning to his chair by the fire. I've read the studies. My grandfather always said wolves were part of the land's soul. This admission seemed to catch Aiyana off guard. She studied him with new interest, as if seeing him for the first time rather than seeing the reputation that preceded him. Your grandfather, Thomas Callahan. He ran this ranch before my father took over. Different philosophy. Ethan poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. He believed in working with the land, not conquering it. And your father? The question hung heavy in the warm air. Ethan felt the familiar weight settle on his chest, the legacy he'd inherited, along with the ranch and the family fortune. My father believed in winning, Ethan said finally, at any cost. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. And what do you believe in? It was a simple question that cut to the heart of every doubt that had plagued Ethan since taking control of the ranch 5 years ago. What did he believe in? Making money had seemed like enough when he was building his business empire. But sitting here in this simple cabin with this woman who risked her life to protect wolves, his achievements felt hollow. I'm still figuring that out, he said honestly. The admission surprised him. He wasn't used to revealing uncertainty, especially to virtual strangers. But something about Aiyana, maybe her directness, or the way she'd accepted his help without excessive gratitude or suspicion, invited honesty. Outside, the wind's fury seemed to be intensifying. The cabin shuddered under the assault, but the solid construction held firm. Ethan found himself grateful for his grandfather's insistence on building things to last. We should try to get some rest, he said. This storm could last until morning. Aiyana nodded, then hesitated. Where will you sleep? Ethan gestured toward the chair by the fire. I'll keep the fire going. Make sure the temperature stays stable. Well, no, that chair won't be comfortable for a full night. I've slept in worse places. She considered this, then shifted toward one side of the narrow bed. This bed is big enough for two if we're careful about boundaries. The offer was practical, born of shared necessity rather than intimacy, but it sent an unexpected jolt through Ethan's system. He found himself hyper-aware of her presence, of the way the firelight caught in her hair and cast shadows across her face. I'll be fine in the chair, he said. Aiyana shrugged, settling back under the blankets. Suit yourself. But if you freeze to death, I'll have to walk out of here alone, and I'm not sure I remember the way. There was humor in her voice, the first he'd heard from her, and it transformed her face completely. The wariness faded, replaced by something warm and almost mischievous. For a moment, Ethan caught a glimpse of who she might be when she wasn't on guard, when she wasn't facing down wealthy ranchers with questionable reputations. I'll manage, he said, but he was smiling now too. As the night deepened and the storm raged outside their small shelter, Ethan found himself more awake than he'd been in years. Not because of discomfort, though the chair wasn't exactly built for sleeping, but because of the presence of the woman across the room. Every so often he would catch himself watching her sleep, noting the way her breathing had returned to normal, the way she seemed to rest completely, without the hypervigilance that had marked her waking hours. In sleep, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but also more peaceful than anyone had a right to look after nearly freezing to death. Around midnight, a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the entire cabin. Aiyana stirred but didn't wake, merely pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders. Ethan added another log to the fire and settled back into his watch. Can't sleep. Her voice came softly from the bed, and Ethan realized she'd been awake for a while. Someone needs to tend the fire. The fire's fine. There's enough wood to last until morning, and the cabin holds heat well. She was right, of course. The temperature had stabilized, and the supply of split wood his grandfather always kept stocked would see them through the night easily. Old habits, Ethan said. My grandfather taught me never to let a fire die when lives might depend on it. Aiyana was quiet for a moment. He sounds like a wise man. He was. He would have liked you. The words slipped out before Ethan could stop them, and he felt heat rise in his cheeks. But Aiyana didn't seem offended by the presumption. Why do you say that? Ethan considered the question seriously. He respected people who fought for what they believed in, even when it wasn't popular or profitable. Especially then. Is that what you think I'm doing? Hey, fighting? Aren't you? She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders again. In the firelight, her eyes held depths he was only beginning to understand. Every day, she said simply, for the animals, for the right to exist without justifying that existence to people who measure worth in dollars. The bitterness in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, and Ethan felt it like a physical blow. How many times had she been dismissed, ignored, or patronized by men who looked exactly like him? I'm sorry, he said. For what? For whatever my people have done to make you feel that way. Aiyana studied him for a long moment, and Ethan had the sense he was being weighed and measured by criteria he couldn't fully understand. You're not what I expected, she said finally. What did you expect? Arrogance? Entitlement? Someone who saw everything, including people, as commodities to be acquired or disposed of as convenient. The accuracy of her assessment of his father, and if he was honest, his younger self was uncomfortable. And instead, I find someone who rides into a blizzard to save a stranger, someone who asks permission before crossing boundaries, someone who seems genuinely troubled by the thought that he might be causing harm. Her words warmed him more than the fire had, but they also carried a weight of expectation that made him nervous. What if she was wrong about him? What if when tested he proved to be exactly what she'd expected in the first place? Don't make me into something I'm not, he said quietly. I'm still figuring out who I want to be. That's more than most people your age are willing to admit. They fell into comfortable silence again, but now it felt different, less like strangers waiting out a storm, and more like two people discovering unexpected common ground. As dawn approached and the wind finally began to die down, Ethan realized something had shifted during their long night in the cabin. The woman sleeping peacefully in the bed across the room had somehow managed to crack something open in his chest, something he'd kept carefully sealed for years. When the first pale light of morning finally filtered through the cabin's single window, revealing a world transformed by snow, Ethan knew that whatever happened next, he would never be quite the same man who had ridden up to Red Mesa Ridge the night before. The storm had given him more than just shelter. It had given him a glimpse of who he might become. Morning light filtered through the cabin's frost-covered window, revealing a world sculpted entirely in white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed almost sacred after the night's fury. Ethan stood at the window, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Behind him, he could hear Aiyana stirring the soft rustle of blankets as she awakened to the transformed world. He'd been up for an hour stoking the fire and preparing what breakfast he could from the cabin's modest supplies, coffee, canned peaches, and hardtack that was older than his last birthday, but still edible. Good morning. Her voice came rough with sleep, but warmer than it had been the night before. Ethan turned to find her sitting up in bed, hair tousled and falling around her shoulders like dark water. Even in the simple white shirt he'd lent her, she looked dignified, composed in a way that suggested she was comfortable with herself in any circumstances. Coffee, he offered, gesturing toward the pot warming by the fire. Please. He poured her a cup, noting how she accepted it with both hands wrapped around the warm metal, a gesture so unconsciously graceful it made his chest tighten. In the morning light, he could see details he'd missed the night before: a small silver pendant at her throat that looked handmade, laugh lines around her eyes that suggested someone who found joy despite life's challenges, and a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with wealth or status and everything to do with knowing her own worth. The storm's passed, he said, settling into the chair with his own coffee. Aiyana nodded, looking out the window at the pristine landscape. At least 3 feet. It'll take time for the roads to be cleared. I radioed my foreman before you woke up. Samuel's organizing search parties for anyone who might have been caught out in the storm. I told him about your horse. Something flickered across Aiyana's face. Surprise, perhaps relief. Thank you. Sage has been with me for 6 years. She's important. Ethan heard the understatement in her voice. In his experience, people who worked with animals often formed bonds that went deeper than simple ownership. The horse wasn't just transportation. She was a partner, maybe even family. We'll find her, he said with more confidence than he felt. The storm had been brutal, and even sheltered animals sometimes didn't survive Montana winters. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, sharing the simple meal with an ease that surprised Ethan. He was used to business breakfasts filled with agenda items and strategic planning or solitary meals taken while reviewing quarterly reports. This quiet companionship felt foreign, but somehow right. I should check in with my supervisor, Aiyana said eventually. Let them know I'm safe. Radio's on the shelf behind you. As she made her call, Ethan found himself listening to the cadence of her voice as she spoke to someone named Dr. Martinez about her situation. Professional calm, but with undertones of affection that suggested more than just a working relationship. When she mentioned being rescued by a local rancher, Ethan noticed she didn't use his name. Everything all right? He asked when she finished the call. Elena was worried. She knew I was out tracking when the storm hit. Aiyana paused, seeming to consider her next words. She also wanted me to remind you that the tribal council meets next week. The words hit Ethan like a splash of cold water. In the intimacy of their shared ordeal, he'd almost forgotten about the pending land deal, the pressure from his board, the decision that could reshape both their communities. She knows about the gas rights proposal, he said. It wasn't a question. Everyone knows. Word travels fast in a small community. Aiyana's voice had cooled, and Ethan saw the wariness returning to her eyes. The reminder of their respective positions in the outside world had shattered the spell of their temporary equality. What do people think about it? He asked. What do you think they think? There was an edge to her voice now. A billionaire wants to buy tribal land to extract fossil fuels. How would any community feel about that? Ethan set down his coffee mug, suddenly losing his appetite. It's not that simple. Isn't it? Is it? The challenge in her voice made him look up, and he saw that the woman who had seemed so peaceful in sleep was now fully alert, every line of her body speaking of someone prepared for battle. The proposal includes significant compensation, he said, hating how defensive he sounded. Jobs for tribal members. Investment in infrastructure. At what cost? What do you mean? Aiyana stood, moving to the window to stare out at the pristine landscape. I mean, what happens to the land itself? What happens to the water table when you start fracking? What happens to the wildlife corridors? The traditional hunting grounds, the sacred sites that aren't on any of your geological surveys? Each question landed like a physical blow. Ethan realized he had answers for some of them. Environmental impact studies, mitigation plans, regulatory compliance measures. But those were corporate answers designed to minimize liability, rather than address deeper truths. There would be environmental protections, he said weakly, like the ones that protected the Missouri River during the Dakota Access Pipeline construction. Aiyana turned from the window, and her amber eyes were blazing. Like the ones that prevented the Exxon Valdez spill, like the ones that kept fracking chemicals out of Pennsylvania's groundwater. The passion in her voice was magnetic and terrifying. This was the woman who had nearly died protecting wolves, who dedicated her life to preserving something most people never even thought about. Facing her righteous anger, Ethan felt small and selfish and utterly out of his depth. I'm not Exxon, he said. No, you're worse. The words hit him like a slap. What's that supposed to mean? Exxon is a corporation. Evil maybe, but predictably so. They exist to maximize profit, and everyone knows it. Aiyana moved closer, and Ethan could see gold flecks in her amber eyes. But you're a person. You have choices. You rescued me from a storm. You spoke respectfully about your grandfather's values. You seemed to care about the wolves. But you're still willing to destroy everything you claim to respect for money you don't even need. The accusation hung between them like a knife. Ethan felt anger rising in his chest, anger at being judged, at being reduced to a stereotype, at having his motivations questioned by someone who knew nothing about the pressures he faced. You don't know anything about my situation, he said. Then enlighten me. The calm request deflated his anger as quickly as it had risen. Aiyana wasn't attacking him out of hatred or prejudice. She was asking him to defend choices he wasn't sure he could defend, even to himself. My father left debts, he said finally. Not financial debts, we've always been profitable, but moral debts. Promises made to communities he never intended to keep. Lawsuits from families whose land he acquired through questionable means. A reputation that precedes me into every business meeting and every community interaction. Aiyana's expression softened slightly, but she didn't speak. I've spent 5 years trying to repair that damage, Ethan continued. Funding schools, supporting conservation efforts, hiring locally whenever possible. But the board sees those expenditures as weakness. They want returns on their investments, and they want them now. So you thought you'd give them a natural gas field? I thought I'd find a solution that could benefit everyone. And if no such solution exists, the question cut to the heart of his dilemma. What if the board was right? What if his attempts to balance profit with principle were simply naive idealism? What if the choice was really between exploiting the land and losing control of his company to people who would have no such scruples? I don't know, he admitted. The honesty seemed to surprise her. Aiyana studied his face for a long moment, and Ethan felt as if she were reading something written there in a language he didn't understand. At least you're honest about that, she said finally. The tension in the cabin eased slightly but didn't disappear entirely. They finished their breakfast in a silence that was no longer comfortable, each lost in thoughts that had as much to do with the world outside as with their temporary sanctuary. It was nearly noon when they heard the sound of engines approaching through the snow. Ethan looked out to see two snowmobiles making their way up the ridge, led by Samuel Brooks, his head foreman. Behind Samuel, Ethan could see another figure that he recognized as Dr. Aiyana Martinez from the reservation's wildlife department. "Looks like our rescue party has arrived," he said. Aiyana moved to the window and Ethan saw a relief wash over her face when she spotted her colleague. Aiyana, she must have been worried sick. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Aiyana dressed quickly in her clothes, which had dried completely by the fire. Watching her transform from the vulnerable woman he'd rescued to the professional biologist preparing to return to her duties, Ethan felt an unexpected sense of loss. "Aiyana," he said as she reached for the door handle. She turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "Last night this morning, it meant something to me. Getting to know you, I mean, beyond the circumstances." For a moment, her professional mask slipped, and he saw something warm and uncertain in her eyes. But then the sound of voices outside reminded them both of the larger world waiting beyond the cabin door. "It meant something to me too," she said quietly. "But meaning something and changing anything are two different things." Before he could respond, she was out the door, moving through the snow toward her colleague with the easy grace of someone born to navigate difficult terrain. Ethan followed more slowly, feeling as if he were leaving more than just shelter behind. The reunion between Aiyana and Dr. Martinez was brief but intense, rapid conversation in what Ethan assumed was Apache, punctuated by relieved laughter and gestures in his direction that clearly identified him as the local rancher who had provided assistance. Samuel's report was more troubling. 3 other people had been caught by the storm, but all had been found safe. Aiyana's horse Sage had been located in the pine grove where Ethan had last seen her. The mare's leg was indeed injured, but not broken, and the reservation's veterinarian was treating her. "What about the poaching signs I found?" Aiyana asked Dr. Martinez. Elena's expression darkened. "We found more snares this morning, professional quality like you described. Someone's been busy." Ethan felt all eyes turned to him, and the weight of unspoken accusations settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He was the largest landowner in the area, the one with the most resources and the most to gain from eliminating wildlife that might interfere with development plans. "I'll investigate immediately," he said. "If any of my people are involved, they'll be terminated and prosecuted." "And if they're acting on orders?" De Martinez asked, her voice carefully neutral. The implication was clear, and Ethan felt his temper flare. But before he could respond, Aiyana intervened. "Ethan Callahan has been cooperative," she said firmly. "If there's poaching happening on his land, I believe he'll address it." The defense surprised everyone, including Ethan himself. Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow, clearly wondering what had transpired during the long night at the cabin to inspire such trust from her usually skeptical colleague. The ride back to civilization was accomplished in convoy, with Ethan sharing Samuel's snowmobile, while Aiyana rode with Dr. Martinez. As they descended from the ridge into the valley, Ethan found himself looking back at the small cabin that had sheltered them through the storm. From a distance, it looked insignificant, just another structure in the vast Montana landscape. But he knew he would never see it the same way again. The parting at the boundary between his ranch and the reservation was awkward and formal. Aiyana shook his hand with professional courtesy, thanking him again for his assistance, but the warmth they had shared in the cabin seemed as distant as the storm itself. "I hope your horse recovers quickly," Ethan said. "She's tough. She'll be fine. And I hope you'll let me know what you find out about the poaching." "Of course." They might have been strangers conducting business rather than two people who had shared fears and hopes and honest conversation through a long winter night. The transformation frustrated Ethan more than he cared to admit. As he watched her snowmobile disappear into the reservation's rolling hills, Samuel cleared his throat. Interesting night, the older man asked. Samuel had worked for the Callahan family for 30 years, serving Ethan's grandfather and father before transferring his loyalty to Ethan himself. He was one of the few people who could ask such questions without overstepping boundaries. Educational, Ethan replied. She's quite a woman. Yes, she is. And you're quite a man with quite a problem. Ethan looked sharply at his foreman. Samuel's weathered face was impassive, but his eyes held the wisdom that came from watching 3 generations of Callahans wrestle with the competing demands of conscience and commerce. What do you mean? I mean you're falling for a woman whose people you might be about to dispossess, and you're too honorable to ignore the contradiction, but too practical to ignore the consequences of choosing sides. The blunt assessment hit close enough to home to be uncomfortable. It's not about falling for anyone, Ethan said. It's about doing what's right. And what is right? I wish I knew. Samuel nodded as if this was the answer he'd expected. Your grandfather used to say that the hardest decisions weren't between right and wrong, but between two different kinds of right. What did he mean? He meant sometimes you have to choose between being right by society's standards and being right by your own standards. And sometimes those aren't the same thing. As they rode back toward the ranch house, Ethan found himself thinking about standards his board's, his community's, his own. For years, he tried to satisfy all three, convincing himself that compromise was possible, that everyone could win if he just worked hard enough to find the perfect solution. But sitting in that cabin with Aiyana, listening to her speak about land and legacy and the price of survival, he'd begun to suspect that some choices couldn't be compromised away. Some choices required a man to decide who he really was, and the deadline for that decision was approaching faster than any storm. The tribal council meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the blizzard. Ethan spent those 7 days in a state of restless agitation, reviewing financial reports, consulting with attorneys, and fielding increasingly urgent calls from board members who sensed his hesitation and didn't like what they smelled. Marcus Webb arrived Tuesday evening, ostensibly to review contract details, but actually to apply pressure in person. Over dinner in the ranch house's formal dining room, he laid out the stakes with characteristic bluntness. The Blackstone offer is real, Ethan. 50% higher than our initial proposal with expedited development timelines that would have gas flowing within 18 months. If the tribal council rejects our proposal and accepts theirs instead, you will be watching billion-dollar profits flow to your competitors. Ethan pushed food around his plate, appetite suppressed by the weight of impending decision. Through the dining room's large windows, he could see the lights of the reservation in the distance, a scattered constellation against the dark prairie. What about the environmental concerns, he asked. What about them? All the studies show manageable impact levels. Modern extraction techniques are completely different from the old days. Aiyana Red Elk seems to think otherwise. Marcus's expression sharpened with interest. The biologist, I heard you two had quite an adventure during the storm. There was something in his attorney's voice that Ethan didn't like, a prurient curiosity that reduced their shared ordeal to office gossip. She knows the land, Ethan said carefully. Her concerns deserve consideration. Ethan, you can't let personal feelings cloud business judgment. These people have been fighting development for generations, regardless of the benefits offered. It's ideological, not practical. The dismissive tone grated against Ethan's nerves. These people have names, Marcus. And maybe they're fighting development because they've seen what it does to communities. Since when do you care about native politics? The question hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire. Since when did he care? Since he'd watched a woman risk her life to protect wolves. Since he'd seen someone value principles over profit without apology or explanation. Since he'd spent a night talking to someone who measured worth by different standards entirely. Since I started thinking about what kind of legacy I want to leave, Ethan said finally. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying his client with new concern. Ethan, I've been your attorney for 8 years. I've watched you build an empire through smart decisions and calculated risks. Don't throw that away for romantic notions about noble savages and environmental purity. The phrase noble savages hit Ethan like a physical blow. It revealed something ugly lurking beneath Marcus's professional veneer, a casual racism that reduced complex people to stereotypes. "I think you should leave," Ethan said quietly. "What?" "I said you should leave, now." Marcus's face flushed red. "Ethan, you're making a serious mistake. The board won't tolerate this kind of indecision indefinitely. They have options." "What kind of options?" "The kind that remove decision-making authority from CEOs who've lost sight of their fiduciary responsibilities." The threat was clear. If Ethan didn't deliver the gas rights deal, the board would find ways to force his hand or replace him entirely. It was a nuclear option, but not an impossible one. Hostile takeovers had been built on less contentious foundations. After Marcus left, Ethan sat alone in his study, surrounded by portraits of previous generations of Callahans. His grandfather smiled down from one frame, the image capturing the weathered kindness that Ethan remembered from childhood visits. His father glowered from another, the hard eyes and thin lips, speaking of a man who saw every relationship as a potential transaction. Which man would he become? The answer came to him in the form of a radio call late Wednesday night. Samuel's voice crackled through the static, urgent with worry. "Boss, we've got a problem. Someone's been running cattle on the reservation's winter grazing areas. Tribal rangers found our brands on about 30 head." Ethan sat up straighter. Grazing rights were carefully negotiated agreements, and unauthorized use of tribal land was both illegal and incendiary, exactly the kind of incident that could destroy any hope of productive negotiations. "How did our cattle get on reservation land?" "That's the thing, boss. They didn't wander. Someone cut the boundary fence and drove them through. Deliberate." The implications hit Ethan like a physical blow. Someone wanted to sabotage the negotiations to create enough animosity between the ranch and the reservation that reasonable discussion became impossible. But who would benefit from such sabotage? The answer came with sickening clarity: Blackstone Energy. If negotiations with the Callahan Ranch broke down, the tribal council might be more inclined to accept Blackstone's higher offer despite the more aggressive development timeline. "Samuel, I want those cattle back on our land immediately, and I want you to find out who cut that fence." "Already working on it, boss." "But there's something else." Dr. Martinez called. "They found more wolf snares today, and this time there was a dead animal. Someone's escalating." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of conspiracy settling around him like fog. The poaching, the cattle incident, the pressure from his board, it all pointed to a coordinated effort to force his hand. "I'm riding out there," he said. "Boss, it's midnight, and the tribal rangers aren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for uninvited visitors right now." "Then I'll invite myself." An hour later, Ethan was riding Thunder through the crisp night air toward the reservation boundary. The moon was nearly full, casting blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape and making navigation easier than he'd expected. But as he approached the fence line where the cattle incident had occurred, he saw something that made him pull up short. Lights, moving through the darkness about a quarter-mile away on the reservation side of the boundary. Poachers. Ethan dismounted and ground-tied Thunder, then moved quietly toward the fence line. The cut section was easy to spot, clean wire cuts that spoke of bolt cutters rather than weather damage. And in the snow beyond, he could see fresh tracks leading toward the moving lights. He was debating whether to call for backup when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the sharp crack of a rifle shot followed immediately by the howl of a wounded animal. Without thinking, Ethan vaulted the fence and began running toward the lights. He had no weapon, no backup, and no legal authority to be where he was, but none of that mattered. Someone was killing wolves, and he couldn't stand by and let it happen. The scene he stumbled into was worse than he'd imagined. 3 men with high-powered rifles and spotlights had cornered a pack of 5 wolves in a small depression between 2 hills. 2 animals were already down dark shapes against the white snow, while the survivors circled frantically, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. "That's enough!" Ethan shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. The men spun toward him, and Ethan found himself looking down the barrels of 3 rifles. In the harsh glare of their spotlights, he couldn't make out faces, but their body language spoke of people who hadn't expected to be interrupted. "Well, well," one of them said, "look what we have here, the billionaire cowboy himself." The voice was familiar, and as Ethan's eyes adjusted to the light, he recognized the speaker, Jake Morrison, one of his own ranch hands. a man he'd hired 8 months ago on Samuel's recommendation. "Jake, what the hell are you doing? What does it look like pest control? On reservation land, with my cattle as cover." Jake's laugh was ugly. "Your cattle, your land, your problem. We're just making sure certain negotiations go the way they're supposed to." The admission hit Ethan like a revelation. This wasn't random poaching. It was sabotage designed to inflame tensions and destroy any possibility of peaceful resolution to the land rights issue. "Who's paying you?" Ethan demanded. "Same people who pay you ultimately. The difference is they're paying us to get results instead of playing nice with the Indians." The racial slur ignited something dangerous in Ethan's chest. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the darkness. "Nobody move." Aiyana stepped into the circle of light, her own rifle trained on Jake Morrison. Behind her, Ethan could see two tribal rangers emerging from the shadows, their weapons also raised. "Dr. Red Elk," Jake said, his tone shifting to mock courtesy. "How nice of you to join us, though you might want to reconsider pointing that rifle at American citizens. You're on tribal land without permission killing protected wildlife." Aiyana replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "That makes you criminals, not citizens. And what about your boyfriend here?" Jake gestured toward Ethan with the barrel of his rifle. "He's trespassing too." Ethan saw Aiyana's jaw tighten at the crude implication, but her aim never wavered. "Mr. Callahan can explain his presence to the tribal council. You can explain yours to a federal judge." The standoff stretched for endless seconds, everyone armed, everyone angry, everyone looking for a reason to avoid the violence that seemed inevitable. Finally, one of the tribal rangers spoke. "Jake Morrison, you and your associates are under citizen's arrest for poaching, trespassing, and destruction of tribal property. Lower your weapons and submit to restraint." "Like hell," Jake snarled. "You people have no authority over us." "Actually, they do," Ethan said quietly. "You're on sovereign tribal land, which means tribal law applies. And since you're here as representatives of my ranch, your actions reflect on me." Jake's face twisted with rage. "You're choosing them over your own people." "I'm choosing what's right over what's profitable." The words came out with more conviction than Ethan had felt about anything in years. Standing in the snow surrounded by wounded wolves and armed criminals who work for him, he finally understood what his grandfather had meant about some decisions requiring a man to choose who he really was. He was choosing to be someone he could respect. The rest happened quickly. Faced with superior numbers and the clear illegality of their position, Jake and his associates surrendered their weapons. The tribal rangers zip-tied their hands while Aiyana moved to examine the wounded wolves. One was beyond help, its injuries too severe for survival. But the other was still breathing, a young male with a bullet wound in his shoulder that looked painful but not fatal. "We need to get him to the veterinary clinic," Aiyana said, her professional mask barely concealing the emotion in her voice. "I'll help," Ethan said. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." The drive to the reservation's veterinary clinic took 20 minutes with Ethan following Aiyana's truck in his own vehicle. By the time they arrived, word had spread about the night's events, and a small crowd had gathered outside the modest building. Dr. Martinez met them at the door, her face grim but relieved. "How bad?" "Survivable," Aiyana replied carefully, lifting the sedated wolf from the truck bed. "But he'll need surgery." As they carried the wounded animal inside, Ethan found himself surrounded by members of the tribal community, some curious, some hostile, and all wondering what the billionaire rancher was doing at their veterinary clinic at 2 in the morning. "Mr. Callahan." The voice belonged to Robert Red Elk, Aiyana's uncle, and the chairman of the tribal council. A man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Red Elk, I understand we have you to thank for interrupting tonight's poaching activity. I was in the right place at the right time. Were you, The question carried subtle challenge. "Or did you know what was happening on your land?" Ethan met the older man's gaze directly. "I had suspicions. I should have acted on them sooner." The honesty seemed to surprise Robert Red Elk. Most men in your position would have found ways to distance themselves from their employees' actions. Most men in my position aren't trying to sleep at night after watching wolves die for profit. A murmur ran through the small crowd. This wasn't the kind of response they'd expected from the man who wanted to buy their land for gas drilling. "Mr. Callahan," Robert continued, "the tribal council meets tomorrow morning to discuss your proposal. In light of tonight's events, I wonder if you might want to reconsider your position. Ethan looked around the room, seeing faces that reflected generations of struggle against exactly the kind of exploitation his proposal represented. He thought about his board's ultimatum, about Marcus's threats, about the financial consequences of walking away from billion-dollar profits. Then he thought about Aiyana's hands as she gentled the wounded wolf, about the trust in her voice when she defended him to Dr. Martinez, about the woman who'd risked her life to protect animals that most people saw only as obstacles to development. "Mr. Red Elk," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly through the clinic's waiting room, "I'd like to withdraw my proposal for gas drilling rights." The silence that followed was profound. Even the overhead fluorescent lights seemed to pause in their buzzing. "Withdraw," Robert asked. "Completely. I don't want to drill your land. I don't want anyone to drill your land. In fact, I'd like to propose a different kind of partnership entirely." "What kind of partnership?" Ethan took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything: his relationship with his board, his financial future, quite possibly his entire life. "Conservation easements, wildlife corridors connecting your land to mine, joint management of resources that benefits both communities without destroying what makes them valuable in the first place." The proposal had formed in his mind during the drive to the clinic, inspired by conversations with his grandfather decades ago about working with the land instead of against it. It would cost him millions in potential profits, would likely trigger a corporate revolution among his investors, and would certainly end his relationship with lawyers like Marcus Webb. It was also the first business decision he'd made in years that felt completely right. "That's a significant change from your previous position," Robert observed. "Yes, sir, it is." "What changed your mind?" Ethan's eyes found Aiyana, who had emerged from the surgery room and was listening to the conversation with an expression he couldn't read. "I remembered what my grandfather taught me about the difference between owning land and belonging to it," he said. "And I met someone who helped me understand which one I wanted to choose." Aiyana's eyes widened slightly, and Ethan saw something shift in her expression. Surprise, perhaps hope, maybe the beginning of something that looked like trust. "The tribal council will need to discuss this new proposal," Robert said carefully. "But speaking personally, I find it intriguing. Take all the time you need. The offer stands for as long as you need to consider it." As the crowd began to disperse and the crisis energy of the night wound down, Ethan found himself alone with Aiyana in the clinic's waiting room. She was still in the surgical scrubs she'd put on to assist with the wolf's surgery, her hair pulled back and her face exhausted, but somehow luminous. "That was quite a speech," she said. "It was quite a night." "Your board won't be happy." "No, they won't. You could lose everything." Ethan considered this. His ranch, his company, his fortune, all of it built on foundations that now seemed less important than they had a week ago. "Not everything," he said quietly. Aiyana moved closer, and Ethan caught the scent of antiseptic and winter air that clung to her clothes. "What happens now?" "Now I go home and prepare for the most difficult conversation of my professional life. And you go home and prepare for what I hope will be the first of many much easier conversations." "What kind of conversations?" "The kind where we figure out whether two people from different worlds can build something together that's stronger than either could manage alone." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the harsh fluorescent light. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "Men like you don't usually change their entire life philosophy overnight. Men like me don't usually get trapped in blizzards with women like you. And women like me don't usually trust men like you with things that matter." "What things matter?" Instead of answering with words, Aiyana reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a gentleness that made his breath catch. It was the first time she'd touched him voluntarily, and the contact sent electricity through his entire system. "The wolves matter," she said quietly. "The land matters. The children who will inherit what we leave behind matter." "And us?" he asked. "Do we matter? That depends." "On what? On whether you mean what you said in there, or whether you're just trying to impress a woman you spent one night talking to." Ethan covered her hand with his own, holding her palm against his cheek. "I meant every word. But even if I hadn't met you, even if there was no us to consider, I would still withdraw that proposal. Some things are more important than money. Such as being able to look at myself in the mirror, being worthy of my grandfather's memory, being the kind of man who saves wolves instead of killing them. Aiyana smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, revealing the warmth and humor that she kept hidden behind professional competence and cultural caution. "Those are good reasons," she said. "Good enough. Good enough for a start." As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, painting the snow-covered reservation in shades of rose and gold, Ethan realized that he was experiencing something he'd never felt before: the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the person he was meant to be with, making exactly the choice his conscience demanded. The financial consequences would be severe. The professional costs would be enormous. But standing there in a small veterinary clinic on tribal land, holding the hand of a woman who had taught him the difference between owning something and cherishing it, Ethan knew he had made the only decision he could live with. Outside, the Montana landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving. But also, he realized, infinitely worth protecting, just like the woman whose hand he held, just like the future they might build together, just like the man he was finally becoming. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the Montana wilderness, where two wounded souls found healing in each other's strength and the courage to choose love over profit. If this story touched your heart, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more tales of redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of unexpected love. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between financial success and personal values? What would you have done in Ethan's situation? Your stories and insights make our community stronger. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of hope, healing, and the beautiful complexity of human connection. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single choice to be better than we were yesterday.